and Jan-Krzysztof Duda win the Candidates 2022 tournament? We're going to look at two of his games today. One of them is a win, one of them is a draw. I'm going to show you why I think Jan-Krzysztof has a chance because he's an endgame expert and he won the 2021 FIDE World Cup. He's one of the younger players in the field. He has the least amount of experience at this high level, but I really do think he has a chance. So this first game, this is from Tata Steel 2022 back in January against Richard Rapport. Duda plays 1d4. Duda's been playing d4 and e4 about 50% of the time each. This game he chose d4. See knight f6, knight f3. And usually in this position, Duda does play kind of the classical setup with pawn to c4. But in this game, he chose the London. So after d5, bishop to f4. This is the London system, putting the bishop out here, knight on f3, keeping that pawn back on c2. Rapport plays bishop to f5, c4, e6. So now we get these sort of symmetric bishops, but it does give Duda the chance to play queen b3 and just get active a little bit more quickly than black. So he goes e3, knight d7, queen b3. Small advantage out of the opening. This pawn tension, c4 and d5, slightly favors white because the white pawn has the option to push or take. The black pawn just has to sit or take. It doesn't have the option to push. So that c4 pawn has one extra option over the d pawn in terms of tension. So Rapport plays bishop to d6, attacking the bishop. And at this point, Duda lets the advantage slip just a little bit. I think the best play is bishop takes d6, c takes d, and knight to c3. Jeffrey Zhang played this against Abasov back in the FIDE Grand Swiss 2021. And white did go on to win that game. So if you want to look that one up, you can. In this game, though, Duda played bishop to g3. And we can see here the dubious symbol above it. This just kind of allows black to equalize with best play. So Rapport takes on c4. You see bishop takes back. Rook to b8. This is kind of a cool thing about watching Rapport's games. He can take a game that's pretty dry, like this current position, not a lot going on, and he can really spice it up. So he's going for this b5 idea. Kind of a cool plan by black. Knight to c3, on to b5. And I know what you're thinking. I was thinking it too. Could white get away with capturing this pawn? Is there any way we could take, maybe trying to do like knight to d6 check? The problem is bishop takes g3, h takes g. Now this knight can be kicked and it's pinned to the queen. So this is not working out so well for white. So Duda has to retreat. Bishop back to e2. Castle. Rook to d1. And we've seen this in the ChessGoals Catalan course. Line the rook up with the queen because black oftentimes wants to play c5 or e5. With the rook sitting on d1 lined up with the queen, white is ready to capture those pawns and create problems with down the d file. So we see queen to e7, and now knight to e5. So Duda's waiting a little bit to castle, and Rapport throws out this crazy move, pawn to b4. It's very brave. My first thought was, well, could white just play knight to c6? Really nice looking fork, hitting the queen, hitting the rook. But the problem is black can play b takes c3, and if white grabs the queen, black can actually take back. So it's a queen sack. And the material count here is +3 for white. Queen takes c3, though, runs into bishop to b4, skewering the queen to the king. And a move like queen to c2 or queen to c4. Black can now play pawn to c2, defended by the bishop. That pawn hits the rook on d1. And after rook c1, knight to b6. Somehow here black has a small advantage according to the computer. It's a -1 advantage. And it's because bishop to b4 check is coming. This king is probably going to be stuck out in the middle. This pawn on c2 is about to become a queen. And even though white's up 3 points, you really can't get that h1 rook into the game. So it feels like white is almost down a rook in this case. So that's a crazy line. That's knight to c6 by white after Rapport plays this very aggressive b4. So Duda must have saw that that wasn't quite working. Goes knight out to a4. So we're still equal position. Now we get this trade in the center. Knight to e4. And here Duda plays the strongest move. So black is actually starting to come back in this game. We see a5 is about to be played soon. Rook to d8. This king is already safe, and black has this extra pawn on c7. So it's a 3 versus 2 on the queen side in terms of the pawns. Duda plays pawn to f3, strongest move on the board. Now we start heading towards an endgame, but Rapport is actually going to pick up a pawn. So after knight c5, pretty much white has to take. Queen takes, eyes this pawn on e5, and if white plays f4 here, this gives black some serious chances to play for the advantage with rook f to d8. And if the king tries to run away, there's bishop to c2, hitting the queen, hitting the rook. White's not having fun in this position. So Duda sacrifices this pawn. And I think he actually had a really good feel for how to play this position in terms of taking this to an endgame. Because after queen takes e5, he simply plays the cool move, rook to d7. And this is where we can watch the endgame master, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, go to work. First step, puts the rook on the 7th rank, attacks c7, eyes the f7 pawn. a5 by black. Now he doubles rooks on the d file, so this other rook is also trying to come down to the 7th rank next. h5 by Rapport, going for counterplay. That makes a lot of sense, trying to soften up this g3 square. Now we see e4 by Duda. I like this a lot. So he's hitting the bishop has to retreat, and it's actually sort of getting boxed out by these light pawns. So compare the e2 bishop to the g6 bishop. One has freedom to move on the queen side, one is stuck over on the king side. Rook 1 to d2. Guards this pawn, so the queen is free to move. h4, and at this point, pretty much Duda has to capture. G takes h. Queen h2, and now bishop to f1. This is a nice move. So what Duda's doing here is after queen takes g3, he's ready to put the bishop on g2 if that queen were to come down to h2 with check. So that's kind of the idea. I think Duda is playing for a win here, and that's most likely the strongest move for black is queen to h2. That's what the computer likes the best, just a little bit better than the other queen moves. But in the game, Rapport plays queen to h5, and I think he kind of gets stuck in this position now where even though he's up one pawn, white's pieces are a lot more active. And Duda doesn't even go for this pawn. He doesn't play rook takes c7. He says, forget that. I'm going for activity. He plays queen over to e3, c5, king g2, a4, bishop c4, a3, b3. So look at what Duda did here. He was able to shut down all of these queenside pawns. The extra pawn on c5, it's a backward pawn. It's kind of stuck there. And after queen to e5, Duda offers this queen trade, realizing that he has this advantage long term going into the endgame. Bishop h5, king g3. And the plan now, march this king up the board. Get that king closer to the black king, double the rooks on the 7th rank, try to create some problems for black. Now we see an inaccuracy by Rapport. This opens up the dark squares. That allows this white king to come up the board. Rook d3, defending the f-pawn, which is under attack. That frees up the king to move. King h4, king g5. It looks a little bit dangerous. There's sometimes checkmating patterns, but there's always this h4 square to run back to currently. Rook h8, though, trying to guard the h file. Rook c7, and now Duda repeats a couple times. I think they must have been close to time control. We're at move 38, and typically time control is at move 40, where the players will get some bonus time added to the clock. Rook back to c7, and now we see a blunder by Rapport. He was just under pressure a little bit too long. Rook to c8 was the best move here, trying to repeat. And I don't know if Rapport felt that he needed to play for a win, but his position was definitely worse, and he probably should have realized that. But after rook to h8, now we see the rook coming down to the 7th rank, doubling the rooks on the 7th. And after rook h to f8, f5 by Duda, and here black resigns. The problem is there's no way to get out of this position for black. If g takes f, for example, e takes back, this bishop is hanging, this pawn is hanging. And if bishop takes f3, another move that could be tried, there's f takes e. This pawn's going to be a goner. The position's just too far for black to come back. Both players realized it. Rapport resigned. So now let's look at a game where Duda played Fabiano Caruana, and Duda's playing the black pieces here. E4, E5. Duda plays both E5 and C5. We get into a Petrov's defense. This is Duda's main weapon against E4, E5 from the black side. It's also one of Fabiano's main weapons from the black side, so that makes this game pretty interesting. Fabi chooses this line with an early knight c3, allowing doubled pawns. This creates an imbalance. One d pawn for black, doubled c pawns for white, and Fabi quickly takes this into opposite side castling territory. And Caruana is showing here, I think, that he wants to play for the win. He's playing very aggressively, and he's a really strong player. He's been number 2 in the world for a very long time. At one point, he was already up to like 2844 rating, I think, pretty much the same rating as Magnus at the time. Drew Magnus in the World Championship a few years back. He had equal score in Classical. He's a really tough opponent to face. So Fabiano's going all out. Pawn to g4, kingside pawn storm. And what Duda does here is he's able to kind of take this to an endgame, and an endgame that he believes he can hold. So let's see what happens coming up. Pawn to c4, bishop moves, rook e8, and now knight to d5. This is a bit shaky by Duda. The computer says g6 was better, but honestly, I looked at this g6 line. This just looks crazy. Queen to d2. White can give the bishop up. After g takes f, look at all the attacking pieces that white has. Knight's in the area, the other rook's ready to come in, queen's ready to come in. I would not want to play this as black, so I don't really blame Duda for making this small inaccuracy. Knight to d5. But now Fabi finds this beautiful tactic, knight to e6. If f takes e, the bishop can take with check, also hitting the knight, so that would win a pawn, and the black king would be exposed. So Duda runs out, and now after queen f3, there's actually a threat. Bishop takes h7 check works here because the queen hits f7, and that king's about to be mated over there in h7. And this sort of causes Duda to make a blunder. So bishop to f6 was not a good move. The best move was, crazy enough, knight takes c3. And this game is just full of tactics. Now queen takes b7, knight takes d1. There are tactics all over the place. So Duda not only proved in game 1 that he can play endgames, in this game too, he's proven that he can hang with Fabiano Caruana when it comes to tactics. And this is a long game, so I kind of want to fast forward through some of the crazy moments and get to the endgame. But just watch what happens here in terms of the trades. We see a sacrifice, bishop for pawn, another sack back of the bishop, a sack of this pawn, knight check. White didn't take the bishop on c3, instead offers the bishop trade. And now all of a sudden, rook h4, queen h7 mate is happening. Knight f6, trying to block that. And finally, queen takes b7. So at this point, finally the tactics are starting to settle down. Duda is up 1 pawn, so 1 point in terms of the material, but he does still have the exposed king and the weak pawn on g6. He plays rook e1, swaps a pair of rooks, brings the other rook over to come into e1. After knight to e6, now there's a major checkmate threat, and the only good move for black here is rook takes e6, which Duda finds. And now we reach this imbalance. We have 13 moves of almost perfect chess with all those crazy tactics. Fabi has had a 2 or 3 point advantage the whole way, according to Stockfish. And at this point, we have a rook for white. And in return, black has 2 pawns and a knight. So 5 points for 5 points. But the rook is so much faster than the knight, it's going to be really hard to hold this for black. And the computer is still showing that healthy 3 or 4 point advantage for the white side. Queen h3 check. Rook takes g6. The engine says would be a little bit stronger, give white some better chances to play for the win. It's a 4.2 advantage. This is a 2.7 advantage. That could make the difference, as we'll see coming up. Duda does an excellent job holding this position. King g8. Couple checks back and forth. This could be kind of going towards the time control, similar to game 1. We're at move 33. Now we see queen a3. Fabi forces the queen trade. So I think he feels confident he can win this. Fabi would not be playing this position for a draw from the white side. But let's see what Duda does. How is he able to hold this position? knowing that that rook is super fast getting around the board attacking the pawns. So both sides try to get their kings in better position. Bobby's playing very aggressively with his king. Rook e1. And then look what Duda does. Puts the king over on d7. So he knows that he needs the king to kind of help out on the queen side. Needs the king to help out with the center. And if you look at his setup, the knight on e7 guards these two squares. The pawn on d6 guards these two squares. The pawn on b5 guards this square. Duda creates sort of this fence around the white king, and the white king is not able to infiltrate black's position. So we have a trade on b5, and here king to c3 is the best move. And I think the idea is the king can maybe try to infiltrate queenside, but it's not so clear. Knight to d5 check is coming immediately, and that king probably has to go all the way back to b2. So that's the stockfish line. King here, king all the way back to b2. It just feels way too passive. So Fabi plays rook to g1, very natural looking move, adding pressure, but that's actually a mistake, and the game is completely equal now. Duda finds the best move, king to c6, and now there's knight to f5 check ideas, and it might be Duda that pushes some pawns up the board pretty soon. h4 by Fabi, we see this fork, and Duda goes and grabs the pawn. And the problem for white is if these pawns all trade off on the king side, it should be pretty easy for Duda to hold the draw as long as this knight can get back over here close to the king and pawns for black. King b4, and look at this knight for Duda. He's just going after all these pawns, creating problems. Knight to f4, and now the knight's coming here. It's close to a checkmate. There's only a couple moves for the white king. King runs out. Duda goes after this pawn, and now he's repeating. So the problem here is let's just give white a random move. The knight can come to d5 check and win this pawn. So Fabi was trying to figure out how do I save that pawn, and there's really no moves for white that make progress. The computer agrees it's a draw. So after king a5, knight e2, king back to b4, game was agreed a draw. So we've seen now Duda had that endgame masterpiece against Rapport in game number 1. We saw him play just as well tactically as Fabiano through this whole middle game after he was in a slightly worse position. And then he holds this endgame very confidently. So Duda can hang with the best of them in terms of endgames. I think he's one of the underdogs for the candidates tournament, but I'm very excited to see how he does playing at this high level. It's top competition, and it would be really fun to see him kind of in the front of the pack, maybe even winning the whole event. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you for the next candidates preview, which is going to be Richard Rapport.